Boulder Police Department, Supplemental Report, Case P96 21871, date December 27, 1996, Homicide Investigation, JonBenét Ramsey, Robert Whitson. Thursday, December 26, 1996, at about 6:05 a.m., I received a page to call the Watch 3 supervisor, Paul Reichenbach. Sergeant Reichenbach advised me that he had responded to a reported kidnapping involving a 6-year-old girl from 755 15th in Boulder. He was requesting detective assistance. I telephoned detectives Linda Arndt and Fred Patterson and asked them to respond to 755 15th. While driving into Boulder, I telephoned detectives Arndt and Patterson, and they advised me they were almost at 755 15th. Therefore, I responded to the police department to make several telephone calls. Those included the following. Number 1, I notified Commander Eller. Number 2, I called the FBI to request their assistance. Number 3, I requested a staff page. Number 4, I spoke with Jim Smith from our sheriff's department, and he advised me that he would give me some information about kidnapping cases. Number 5, I did a preliminary advisement to PIO Leslie Ahome. And number 6, I responded to the Justice Center and advised Deputy District Attorney Pete Hofstrom. I responded to 755 15th at about 9:15 a.m. Upon my arrival, I met with Detectives Patterson and Arndt. They advised me that John and Patsy Ramsey were the parents of the missing 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey. I was told the Ramseys have a 9-year-old son, Burke, who had left the residence to stay with friends. Supplemental Whitson, page 2. I was advised that Officer Barry Weiss had already photographed the house and didn't find any signs of an obvious crime scene where there had been a struggle. I was also told there were no signs of forced entry and there were no footprints of possible suspects found outside of the home. Officer Rick French was still present and meeting with friends of the family. Officer Sue Barklow was present and obtaining latent fingerprints. I didn't want to disturb any possible evidence in JonBenét's bedroom, so Patterson, Arndt, and I placed police tape over the door and advised Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey not to enter the bedroom. Detective Patterson advised me that telephone traps and traces had been placed on the Ramseys' telephone and a tape recorder was attached in case the suspect called. Detective Patterson advised me that a ransom note had been found in the home and that Officer Carl Veach had placed it into evidence. Detective Patterson also advised me that Mr. Ramsey has 330 employees at his business, Access Graphics, and a list of employees was being obtained. Mr. Ramsey had only one possible suspect from his business, blank. He had been terminated and may be upset with Mr. Ramsey. Detective Patterson also advised me that the maid, blank, was a possible suspect since she had a key to the house and had recently asked to borrow money from the Ramseys. He advised me that a telephone trap was being placed on her telephone in blank. Blank has a significant other who had a criminal history. I was also advised that arrangements had been made with the Pearl Street Bank for $118,000 in ransom money to be available if needed. Detective Patterson also stated that Officer Weiss had taken photos of JonBenét and was making copies to give to officers. I briefly spoke with John Ramsey. I asked Mr. Ramsey if he was sure the doors were locked when he got up. Mr. Ramsey said he was sure the doors were locked when he got up and when he went to bed the night before. I asked Mr. Ramsey for a sample of his and his wife's handwriting, just as a standard procedure. Mr. Ramsey gave 2 notepads to Detective Patterson, who in turn gave them to me. I was advised one of the pads was for Mr. Ramsey and the other was a sample of Mrs. Ramsey's writing. I wrote their respective names on the notebooks at the top, but didn't look at the samples or pay any attention to them at that time since I wanted to leave the house as soon as possible for a meeting with the FBI at the police department. I provided a brief summary of what had been done at the time to Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, and I advised them we would be meeting with the FBI for their advice before deciding how to proceed. Whitson, supplemental page 3. Detective Patterson and I checked the area near the Ramseys' home for any suspicious-looking people or vehicles and did not see anyone unusual. I responded to the police department and met with several detectives and representatives from the FBI. During this meeting, Detective Jeff Kithcart came into the room and I handed him the 2 notepads which I was given as samples of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey's handwriting. These items were later placed into evidence as items number 1 raw and number 2 raw. A few minutes later, Detective Kithcart returned to the room to show me something in the notepad which had been identified as Mrs. Ramsey's handwriting sample. There were 2 or 3 pages of writing. Then there was a page which was written in a felt marker that stated Mr. and Mrs. R, which matched the same type of writing in the ransom note. It was obvious that some pages prior to this page had been torn from the notepad. I didn't touch the page this was written on. At that time, I questioned if Patsy Ramsey was a possible suspect. I asked myself, why would a stranger take the time to stay in the Ramseys' house and write a ransom note? At that time, the focus of the investigation changed to include a possible family member as well as someone from outside the family. And if a family member was a suspect, we needed to obtain a search warrant before we collected additional evidence from the house. I can't remember the exact time, but shortly after the evidence of the notepad was discovered, everyone in the meeting was advised that the deceased body of JonBenét had been found. I left the meeting and responded to 755 15th. When I entered, I observed Patsy Ramsey on the living room floor near the front door, holding JonBenét. Patsy was crying and very upset. I don't know his name, but a person who was identified as a minister tried to comfort Patsy. I requested that Patsy and everyone else move into a different room. I did not attempt to examine JonBenét's body or any other evidence, and I did not go into the wine cellar or downstairs, where she was supposedly found by Mr. Ramsey. When Sergeant Mason arrived, Detective Palmer and I returned to the police department. I placed the 2 notepads into evidence and Detective Palmer checked them out, as well as the original ransom note, so he could take them to the CBI for processing. I wrote the lab requests and the letter to the CBI. On Thursday, December 26, 1996, I conducted a neighborhood canvass along with Detective Pat Whiten and Barry Hartkop. I spoke with the neighbors on 14th Street, between Cascade and Baseline, on the east side of the street. These houses would be across the alley from the Ramseys' home. Number 1, 792 14th, not home. Whitson, supplemental, page 4, end.